All right, welcome to Journey Through the Bible tonight. We are in Matthew chapter 16, beginning with verse 13. In this section of his ministry, Jesus traveled to Caesarea Philippi. Now, Caesarea Philippi was at the very northern part of Israel. It's up above the Sea of Galilee and just at the foot of Mount Hermon. And in this location, Peter delivers his good confession. This Caesarea is different from the Caesarea that's over here on the coast, Caesarea Maritima. That was Herod's seaport that was built on the coast of the Mediterranean. This Caesarea was originally called Paneas or Paneas, and it contained a large spring that flowed from a grotto. And here's a picture of the water and the grotto behind that. It was dedicated to the god Pan. Pan was the Greek god of desolate places and victory in battle, who was considered to be the source of fear when an enemy fled. Hence our word panic. Whenever a group of soldiers was routed, it was called a panic, thought it was inspired by the god Pan. This territory continues to be known as Banias today in modern Israel. And although it has ancient roots, Paneas traces its formal settlement to the time of Alexander the Great. You'll remember his successors, the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria, fought for control of the territory of Palestine. Here it was a buffer zone between them. When this territory was under the control of the Ptolemies, the Egyptian kings, they built a cult center there, probably as a frontier outpost for the empire to guard against Seleucid encroachment from the north. It was particularly important as a cult and military site because of its proximity to two major highways through the region. And so here you can see Damascus, here's Caesarea Philippi here. This is the King's Highway, which runs down the east side of the Jordan, a major north-south route. And then you would take the other route, which one branch went through the hill country, but the other was known as the Way of the Sea, and it was a common means for armies from Egypt to traverse. And so Caesarea Philippi is located near the junction of those roads and is very important for that reason. Now, a major battle was fought in the vicinity in 198 BC. It was called by the Greek historian Polybius the Battle of Paneum. It was a battle in which the Seleucids under Antiochus III defeated the Ptolemies of Egypt and once and for all took over the control of Palestine from Egypt. Ultimately, this led to Antiochus' son, Antiochus IV, profaning the temple in Jerusalem, which we have talked about during our study of the time between the Testaments. So, in honor of the victory of Antiochus III, the Seleucids built a pagan temple to Pan on the site, and Palestine remained in control of the Seleucids for about the next 40 years until the time of the Maccabean revolt, when the Jews were successful in throwing off Seleucid rule. Now, the history, though, doesn't end in the time BC, in the time of the Maccabees. During the First Jewish-Roman War, which we know as the fall of Jerusalem in AD 66, actually started in Caesarea Maritima in AD 66. Jerusalem fell in AD 70, and then finally the last outpost, Masada, fell in AD 73. The Roman general Vespasian, who would eventually become emperor of Rome for 10 years, rested his troops at Caesarea Philippi in July of AD 67, and he held games over a period of 20 days before moving on to Tiberias, on the west shore of the Sea of Galilee to crush the Jewish resistance in Galilee. It was this battle which led to the surrender of the Jewish general Flavius Josephus, who predicted that Vespasian would become emperor and became his court historian, and wrote both the Antiquities of the Jews and the Jewish Wars, which are preserved to this day and contain much of the information that we have about the Jewish nation outside of the Bible. And so Josephus is a very good source for that. Now, in the vicinity of Caesarea Philippi, Jesus asked his disciples two important questions, which led to one of the most important statements in the New Testament, the good confession of Peter in Matthew chapter 16. So when Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." So Peter's response is probably the most famous verse in the book of Matthew. Probably second to that, the second most famous verse is Matthew 28:18 through 20, that we know as the Great Commission. Either one of those scriptures, by the way, would be good to commit to memory, Matthew 16:16 or Matthew 28:18 through 20. So let's diverge for just a minute and talk about a special topic, the church. Matthew is the only gospel writer who uses the Greek term church. You'll find it in chapters 16, 18, and then in chapter 18, verse 17. So the Greek word for church is ekklesia, and it literally means called out. So in the New Testament, the church consists of those who have been called out by God to follow Christ. In ancient Greek sources, the term is also used for public assemblies, sometimes for political purposes. So as Matthew uses the term, I think he's using it as an assembly of those called by God for his kingdom purposes. And then we come to Matthew 16:21, where we find the second transition. You remember in our outline, we're looking at three sections in the book of Matthew, all delineated by the statement "from that time on." And so the second transition appears there. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed on the third day and raised to life. And so this transition takes us from the second part of Matthew into the final section of Matthew, which has to do with the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus the Messiah. Now for this section of Matthew, I'm going to be following the outline of R.T. France in his commentary on Matthew from the Tyndale Bible series. And so if you want to look up some more detail, you can do that. Now let's look at the first section in this third division of the book of Matthew, and that is Jesus teaches his disciples about his kingdom mission. This takes up the bulk of one chapter between 16:21 and 17:27. In Matthew 12:40 that we looked at earlier, Jesus had made the first veiled reference to his eventual death and burial. He made mention of the fact that as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Again, unless you knew what Jesus was talking about there, you probably wouldn't pick up on that. But there will be 4 more statements that Jesus makes in the book of Matthew about his coming death. So there are 5 in total, and we'll look at them. Hopefully we'll get through all of those tonight. But Matthew 16:21 that we just looked at poses the first time that Jesus began to openly discuss his coming death with his disciples. Now the disciples were so taken back by Jesus' statement that Peter offered his famous rebuke of Jesus. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." Of course, notice that this is just a few verses after Peter has given his good confession. And so in Peter, we see the juxtaposition here of great insight from the Holy Spirit and then yielding to the temptation of the evil one to try to dissuade Jesus of his coming death and his sacrifice for all mankind. But this warning was shortly followed by one of the clearest declarations of Jesus' divinity that we find in the New Testament. Let's see. Oh, forgot about Jesus had warned his disciples that they would also experience the same suffering, same type of suffering and death that he went through. And of course, from what we know of tradition outside of the Bible, every one of the apostles, save the Apostle John, did meet their end, giving their lives for Jesus. And the Apostle John did not fail to give his life for Jesus, not because of his own efforts, but because the attempts to put him to death failed. And he lived out his life then, probably in the vicinity of Ephesus. So, on to the Transfiguration. We read in Matthew chapter 17, verse 1, "After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up to a high mountain by themselves. And there he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun. His clothes became white as the light. And just then appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus." Now, Moses and Elijah in this remarkable event represent the law and the prophets. Now, we've talked before about how the Jews of Jesus' day divided what we have in our Bibles as the Old Testament into the law and the prophets. The law was the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy. The prophets, they considered everything else, the other 34 books that we have in our Bible. And I have pointed out to you before that the Jewish Bible contains the same material, essentially, that we have in our Protestant Bibles, although the divisions of that material are slightly different. So, overwhelmed by this event, Peter offered to make 3 booths for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah, as was typically done in the Festival of Tabernacles. We'll talk about that in just a few minutes when we come, because Jesus is going to come to a Feast of Tabernacles here very shortly in the book of Matthew. And after Jesus offered to build these 3 booths for them, we have recorded one of the rare instances of the voice of God in the Bible. While Peter was still speaking, a bright cloud enveloped him, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." So, again, the voice of God coming from heaven is not a normal event. It occurs only a few times in the Bible. Well, of course, the next thing the disciples knew, the appearance had ended. Moses and Elijah were gone. Jesus was rousing them and encouraging them not to be afraid. Now, let me point out to you at this point that there's no clear indication in the Bible about how time progresses in a vision or does not progress in a vision. For instance, you'll remember at the account of Zechariah in the temple, the interaction that he had with the angel there probably took a minute or 2 at the most. It seems very short. Yet the text actually says, Luke 1:21 says, that the people outside were wondering why he delayed so long in the temple. And so when it comes to God providing visions, the normal time frame that we think of as humans may or may not apply depending on what God chooses to do and how quickly or slowly he chooses to do it. Remember that God is in control of time, and so he can make time go as quickly or as slowly as he wants to. So we don't know how long the transfiguration actually took place, or whether the disciples were even awake for the whole of the transfiguration. It's one of those mysteries that will only be understood, I think, when we stand before God. Of course, then on the other hand, when we stand before God, all the questions we had here probably aren't going to seem very relevant when we stand in the presence of Almighty God. And so it may be that our questions either are answered by God, or we're just going to not even line up to ask God our questions anymore because it's not going to seem that important. So immediately when they came down from the mountain, Jesus was confronted by the situation of a demon-possessed boy, which the remaining disciples had attempted to cast out, but failed. Jesus instructed them on having faith and declared that great works of God require great faith. The disciples came to Jesus in private and asked, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" He said, "Because you have so little faith." I'll tell you the truth. If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, "Move from here to there," and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. Now, the traditional site of the Transfiguration is Mount Tabor, which is this mountain you see here in the background. It's just to the east of Nazareth. Although another possibility is that it might have been Mount Hermon, which is a much taller mountain to the north. So we're not exactly sure. Traditional attributions of sites concerning the Bible can be relatively uncertain. And so the traditional site is Mount Tabor, but an alternative is Mount Hermon. And here's a little chart for you that demonstrates the relative heights of different places in the land of Israel. So you can see sea level here is this dashed line. Jericho, of course, being below sea level, the Dead Sea pretty far below sea level, as well as the Sea of Galilee. So everything from Lake Hula, north of Sea of Galilee, in the region of Caesarea Philippi, all the way down to the Dead Sea, is below sea level if you're following down the Jordan Valley. Now, in the south, you can see Bethlehem and Jerusalem are both on hills, and so it was a pretty good climb from Jericho up to Jerusalem. We'll talk about that as we get a little further here in the book of Matthew. We've talked before in our study of the Old Testament about Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, which played an important role in the Old Testament and also in the New Testament, being the territory of the Samaritans. Then there's Nazareth, Mount Tabor you can see here, and then ultimately Mount Hermon, the tallest peak in the area. And so when Jesus mentioned a mountain being cast into the sea, he could have been indicating Mount Tabor, but he may also have been indicating Mount Hermon. Again, those are two possibilities. We're not certain of which is the case. This section is followed by Jesus' third announcement of his suffering and death, found in Matthew chapter 17. When they came back into Galilee, which is a clue to me that at least in Matthew's chronology, it might appear that they were still in the region of Caesarea Philippi, and the mountain involved might have been Mount Hermon instead of Mount Tabor. But when they came back to Galilee, he began to speak to them again about being betrayed, that Jewish leaders were going to kill him, and then the third day raised to life. Now, as soon as they returned back to Galilee, they went back to Capernaum, to Peter's house, evidently, and Peter was confronted by temple tax collectors. Now, the temple tax was instituted in Exodus chapter 10, verse 13. It was the one tax in New Testament times that was collected by the Jews. It was also one of 4 taxes mentioned in the New Testament, which we talked about when we began our study in Matthew. The didakmon, the temple tax, is the tax that we're talking about here. The kinsos, a tax on individuals, which we believe was what led Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem to pay that tax. The phoros, a general word for all taxes, and we discussed the fact that there were plenty of different taxes under the Roman system. And then the telos usually refers to duties that were leveled at ports of entry, which we believe is what Matthew collected there at Capernaum. All right, let's move on to the second section now. Jesus begins to talk about relationships in the kingdom. This takes up pretty much the whole of chapter 18. And this also begins the fourth great teaching section in the book of Matthew. Remember, I told you as we began, there were 5 different teaching sections in Matthew. The Sermon on the Mount, Commission of the 12 in chapter 10, chapter 13, the 8 parables describing the kingdom. Chapter 18, here we have the illustration of kingdom relationships. And then 23 and 24 and 25, we're going to talk about the kingdom and the end of the age. Now, this teaching session was initiated by Jesus' disciples' question about who, or at least their debate maybe amongst themselves, about who was going to be the greatest in the kingdom. And this section contains 4 related subjects: the greatest in the kingdom, the parable of the lost sheep, the sinning brother, and the parable of the unmerciful servant. So let's look shortly, briefly at these sections. First of all, the greatest in the kingdom. This is not the only time that Jesus would address who was going to be greatest in the kingdom with his disciples. Here they asked Jesus what seems to be a general question, kind of hinting at what was really on their minds. Which one of us is going to be your right-hand man when it comes time for you to be enthroned in your kingdom? In Matthew 20:28, which we'll get to very shortly, James and John send their mother to just boldly ask if they can sit on the right hand and on the left hand. We'll talk about his response to them when we get to that section. But in chapter 18 here, when they asked this question, Jesus brought a little child in and set that child down and said, I tell you the truth, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. In the parent-child analogy that Jesus is using here, God is the parent and Jesus' disciples are the children. Now keep in mind that children were not highly regarded in ancient times. They had no rights. They began working as soon as they were old enough to do anything useful. They were typically considered a possession like an ox or a donkey or a wife rather than a fellow human being. And so by this declaration, Jesus elevates the standard of children considerably, very much like he elevated the standard of women in his day and gave them more importance and more rights than they had had previously. In Matthew chapter 18, verse 10, Jesus would tell his disciples, see that you do not look down on one of these little ones, for I tell you, their angels in heaven always see the face of my Father in heaven, raising the possibility there that there might possibly be individual angels who care for individual children, or maybe even for individual people, although the context there is uncertain. So then we move on to the parable of the lost sheep. Of course, you're probably familiar with this parable. It continues the discussion of greatness in the kingdom. Now, the parable of the lost sheep is often misinterpreted. The lost sheep that Jesus has in mind specifically here is a child who has lost its way. And that's evidenced by the last statement in his parable, that in the same way your Father in heaven is not willing that any one of these little ones should be lost. So I have heard people draw a myriad of analogies out of the parable of the lost sheep. What Jesus is talking about is a child who has lost its way specifically. And then we come to chapter 18, verse 15, the sinning brother. God is a loving God, and his nature is, in his heart, are for healing and restoration. And for these reasons, Jesus taught his disciples they're not to quickly give up on relationship, but seek every option to be restored with others. Specifically, Jesus addressed a sinning brother here. Now, previously, you'll remember, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus addressed the issue that if you have something against someone, then you need to go and settle that issue with them. Here, it's if someone has something against you. And Jesus recommends making 3 attempts before giving up on the relationship: to go to the brother personally to seek reconciliation, to take others with you as witnesses or mediators, or to take the issue to the church. Now here, taking the issue to the church probably means taking the issue to the church leaders, not necessarily bringing a trial into the midst of the church body. If none of these attempts are successful, Jesus says, only then can you treat your brother as a stranger or as an outcast. Now in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul would extend Jesus' teaching and declare that if anybody in the church has a legal matter against a fellow Christian, to let the church be the arbitrator of the dispute. And he goes on to add, in no case should you take another Christian to court, because the kingdom of God should not be dragged through the mud before unbelievers. Settle these things, he says, amongst the church. Okay, I'm going to pause right there because I think we're going to run out of time. We'll come back in just a few minutes and pick up in chapter 18, verse 23, with the parable of the unmerciful servant.